Media-Wize would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we host this webinar. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations people listening today. We also want to acknowledge that these lands have always been a place of learning and sharing of information, and that is the essence of today's webinar. So thank you everybody for attending. Those of you attending as guests today will notice that we've changed things in face of one of our participants. Chris Player, unfortunately, has been unable to attend due to illness, but the managing editor at Next Media, Andrew Birmingham, has stepped into the fray at very short notice. So we thank Andrew for doing that. So we'll do a very quick introduction of our guests today. I'll start with the Brady Bunch screen I have in front of me has Simon Sharwood up in the top left-hand corner. So I'll get Simon to introduce himself firstly.
Oh, hi, I'm Simon Sharwood. I'm Asia Pacific editor of the Register, joining you today from my garden shed / gym / bicycle storage / comic book repository.
Thanks, mate. Appreciate that. And mine is also a comic book repository and also a vinyl record repository over to the side. We also have David Swan with us from The Australian. David, welcome. If you could give a quick intro.
Yeah, lovely to be here. I only have one comic book in this room. It's The Watchmen.
And joining us today at very short notice, Andrew Birmingham from Next Media. Thanks, Andrew.
I have no comic books. I filled Simon's job. So when he left, I jumped in over here. So I'm quite derivative, but I'm group managing editor of Next Media.
Yeah, and you've recently started off that new lovely publication, Digital Nation, which has been pretty good to see progressing very quickly.
Yeah, no, it's done really well actually. I've really enjoyed that. And it's the two journos on there are excellent.
Awesome. So thanks very much, guys, for joining us today. We're going to kick off with our first question. What are the stories that are of most interest to you at the moment?
I think right now we're seeing a bit of a market shift, and I think everyone can feel that. You can feel it at the hip pocket level as a consumer. You can feel it sort of at all levels of the economy, where I feel like in tech, we're going from a lot of sort of rapid growth and good news stories and success to more really challenging sort of environment. And so I think the tone and the nature of our reporting is going to reflect that. So I think for me right now, the focus is what are the companies that will survive, which are failing. It's going to be a bit of a bloodbath, I think, out there. So in terms of right now, that's sort of what I'm on the lookout for, is sort of how the tech industry reacts to this real challenging economic period that we're right in the middle of.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because when I speak to Simon, for example, you've got a very different focus to David's. Whereabouts are you at, Simon? What are the sort of things that get you excited in story writing land?
So we've got two focuses. One is informing hands-on IT professionals about the key technologies and suppliers that they work with. And the other is we serve a global audience. So for IT pros, that's developers, sysadmins, database administrators, network wranglers, UX people, CX people, anybody who's hands-on with tech. And what we try to bring them is news of the technologies and the suppliers that they are going to be hands-on with as they build the world of tech. That means we tend to concentrate on the most broadly used technologies and the most broadly used companies. Because we're a global publication, we're really looking for stories that are going to appeal to our readers all over the world. And the bulk of those are in North America and in Europe. So we're just not an outlet that really cares about much that happens in Australia. I'm doing a wee story today about, China's little waft out into the Pacific to try and get them all to buy Huawei gear, but it really needs to be something of that kind of, global or strategic significance for us to get excited about a story from anywhere near Australia.
That's really interesting. And I suppose those two contrasts, and then we've got Andrew over here who's going to talk to us a little bit about perhaps what's being looked at from the CRN point of view in the channel, which is something that Chris was going to cover, but also perhaps more broadly with Digital Nation.
Also, I'd say there's really two things in particular. So just to echo David's point, this is specifically around CRN. we've had a slow motion stock market crash over the last 3 months. What happens next, and it happens at the end of every correction or crash, however you want to characterize it, is a liquidity crunch. And so we're moving into a period of really tight liquidity. All these IT companies, particularly a lot of the platform vendors whose businesses have been based or have been fueled largely because the US Fed Reserve gave them free money, that game's over. That's going to start feeding into a requirement on those businesses to actually start delivering a return, because it's going to be harder to raise money, and the money they do raise is going to be more expensive, and the investors are going to be more aggressive about accelerating return to profitability. That's going to feed into the channel pretty dramatically in terms of the relationship between the vendors and their partners, I suspect. So on that side, I think that's a really interesting story right now. On the digital nation side, we tend to kind of look at what's 2 or 3 years out, basically. So one of the areas we're really interested in investing pretty heavily in is the emergence of Web3 technologies, which right now are completely on the nose. Thank you, Simon, for that eye roll. But I think a lot of this stuff is actually quite transformative. A lot of it, though, is it's very early days. So we're like NFTs, so Simon can roll his eyes again. Where that is right now is where blockchain was 8 or 9 years ago, which is basically a solution looking for a problem. But if you start to see the emergence of things like sort of distributed finance and other things, I think there's some really interesting sort of ideas around that. I can tell you from the work that we do with the readers of Digital Nation, this is one of those areas where the readers, the audience, are ahead of the media. They're already making the investments. So the investments aren't massive. These are $5 to $10 million scale investments as opposed to $100 million investments. But there's a lot of positioning going through, because the lesson they all learned out of the last couple of sets of transformations is, the idea that, you can let the startups go through and build all the capability, then you can go and buy them. They've all learned you can't do that, because by the time you get around to buying them, those startups are worth 150, 200 million bucks. So that to me is a really kind of interesting area of growth at the moment.
It's interesting. When you start to talk about this Web3 stuff and metaverse, I read an interesting analysis this morning, and the enterprise is probably going to be the first one to find the value in some of this stuff. I mean, You deal with the enterprise tech vendors quite heavily, Simon, and that's the space that you're really heavily in. Is that the flavor you're kind of getting? Because the thing that you're seeing at the moment is that enterprise is going to go first and the consumers are going to follow, which is kind of different to how a lot of other technology trends have happened over the last decade or so.
I really haven't spent a lot of time tracking Web3 because, I mean, if you look at the genesis of it, the VC firm Andreessen Horowitz put out a paper kind of saying Web3 is here and it exists in about September, October last year, and a whole bunch of people agreed. And I kind of fundamentally reject the proposition that something's happening because one person wrote an article about it, kind of glomming together interest around a whole bunch of different technologies. If we have a look at the actual enterprise maturity of blockchain, I think the Australian Stock Exchange's attempt to rebuild itself on blockchain, now stretching into probably a 7th year, is a reasonable indicator of how mature the technology is and how ready for adoption it is. But to Andrew's previous point about cash crunches, we broke the story early this year that I think at least Google Cloud and Amazon Cloud are extending the life of their server infrastructure from 3 years to 4 years in order to control their costs and basically shove less capital out the door. And I think if those guys who tap rivers of gold are starting to spend their cash more wisely, then yeah, there's certainly something going on out there.
So for people in the audience there, if you've got questions for any of our panelists, please feel free to pop them into the chat. If it's for a specific person, please make that clear. If you've got a particular question for Simon, David, or Andrew, we do have I think the quote so far is that bloodbath for the tech industry should be on a t-shirt. So David, you can put dibs on that one and start printing your own money on those t-shirts. But that's certainly a thing that we are hearing, that there is a big capital crunch coming, and it's going to be pretty tough going for a lot of organisations over the next couple of years. So I know what it was like when I was in journo land, receiving pitches and getting press releases and emails almost constantly all day, literally hundreds a day. How many stories are you guys doing? And like, how does someone cut through and beat the delete key on your when you're going through your inbox? What are the things that are going to get through to you? Maybe I'll start this one with Andrew.
But the most important thing is to understand the publication you're pitching to. It's it doesn't take a lot. It's not like there's a lot of publications. For any given client, there's probably only at max 10 to 12 publications that you really need to pitch into. It's not that hard to understand what they want. I won't speak for the guys, but for me, one of the more frustrating things is when people, the pitching stories that don't make sense for the publication. The other sort of piece really is, a light touch is pretty important. So I'll speak now to the digitalization piece. As a general rule, we want to hear from the executives and the board members. We don't particularly want to get a lot of the sort of the input from I don't want to get input from the vendors. We don't quote a lot of the vendors, so I'm not very interested in the input because I understand what's going on, but the voice of the publication is the voice of the readers. And then I guess the other thing is, it's a bugbear, I guess, is we don't run unsolicited bylines, so don't send them. It's if we're interested in the topic, we'll call you and talk to you about it. But we're not. If you want to run an unsolicited byline, ring up the sales guys and pay them a bunch of money. Okay, don't try and sort of push it in through us.
What about for you, David?
I'd say a couple of things. I mean, one, at a macro level, I think we've all been in the industry long enough that we've seen the shift every year where the number of comms people has grown and the number of journalists in the industry has shrunk. And that's just exacerbated every single year that we've been in the industry. So that has a sort of tangible impact on our inboxes in terms of just, you're saying sort of 100 a day, and that's the reality of what it is. Like, it's hard to understand, but it's like every 5 minutes there's a pitch coming through, and it means that a lot of our days, particularly as editors, is spent sort of sifting through that and on sort of admin versus actually writing the stuff. So in order to cut through that, it has to be something pretty special, and an exclusive helps. We're a bit deeper now with our coverage than I think we were a few years ago. I think because we're a paywall newspaper and we're trying to do more with less. So we're doing fewer stories than I think we were. I think we were trying to, a couple of years ago, try and do everything. And you sort of learn that if people are paying for content, they want something that is more in depth and that has numerous voices in there, numerous perspectives, and is genuinely worth paying for. So I think for a pitch then to be successful, it can't just be a shallow, we've raised $1 million. It has to really go deeper and say, here's what we're aiming to do with it. Here are some other people you can interview as well. Sort of, if you put that work in at the pitch level, then it's more likely to result in a successful newspaper story. I just think the coverage is, at least what we're trying to do is do something, deeper and meatier than maybe we were comfortable with doing earlier. I just think it is crazy out there, just the number of, and like the tidal wave of pitches that we're getting every day. It's really intense.
Simon, I'm not sure if it was a nod in agreement or a sigh of agreement.
I'm going to reject the premise of the question.
Love it.
Because I don't think that inbox pressure alone is what the media relations community needs to measure. I think you need to consider the volume of wanted versus unwanted information flowing towards a journalist. So I curate about 400 RSS feeds. I have Twitter alert me to when interesting people are tweeting. I have LinkedIn alert me to when interesting people are, I don't know what the verb is for LinkedIn, are posting stuff to LinkedIn. I have a bunch of stuff that I've requested to land in my inbox. So, newsletters, stock market alerts, a whole bunch of stuff. Now, the 8 or 10 email pitches that I get a day, and I don't get many because I've spent years pushing back against them, the 8 or 10 email pitches I get a day are the stuff I didn't ask for. So you're not just competing with other media relations people sending stuff into my inbox, you're competing with all the stuff I've already identified as more likely to be newsworthy than you.
All right.
So I write, 3 or 4 stories a day, occasionally more, and I'm usually working on a feature as well. And I reckon maybe one a fortnight comes from something that was sent direct to my inbox. And that's usually something that's time sensitive rather than something that's kind of a searingly good pitch, or that or that comes from a place I think is going to be newsworthy.
Andrew?
There's two things I just want to add to that. On CRN, one of the problems I think in IT media at the moment, because everybody's sort of chasing clicks and numbers basically, is we don't reflect enough. So one of the things I want to sort of change about the way that works is less chasing the kind of hourly news cycle, particularly in a world where there's 2 newsletters a day. I actually want the journos actually spending more time on the phone, ringing people up, not writing, not reporting basically. So that will be, you'll see that as a change in the nature of the way that CRM reports going forward. On the Digital Nation side, the way we tend to operate is we have a Monday meeting where we look at everything that's come in. We make a determination about what we might do. And it's different because we tend to be a very video-led publication. And so there's a lot more sort of background work needs to happen before we can produce a story. So the best way to kind of pitch to us, if you have what you think is a really interesting story idea, certainly get in contact and describe it to us. If we like the idea, we'll then take that into an editorial meeting, and you might get 10 or 15 ideas that turns into one in the actual 1 or 2 in the meeting. And then, we'll basically steal the clever idea you had and turn it into our own by bringing other people into it, basically. So that's the sort of process that we put in place.
What I picked up from all 3 of you that's really interesting is when we do our media training, we talk to clients about the number of journalists versus the number of stories versus the number of publications, is that over the last 5 years or so, we've lost about 20 journos a week out of the business. And that's industry-wide. That's not just tech. That's right across the whole board of everything from lifestyle through to, automotive and whatever. And that's put the pressure into the business, where we've tried to maintain a publishing cycle with far fewer players. And it sounds like all 3 of you are saying that we're actually about quality stories, not quantity stories now. And they're about targeted stories that are focused specifically on the audiences you serve. So, with David behind his paywall, your people are expecting a different quality of service because they're paying for it. And the same with you, Simon, with people are expecting a very targeted set of stories that focus on those IT professionals that are interested in key vendors and key technologies. I think that's perhaps the big takeaway here is think about who you're asking to, think about who you're taking the story to, and think about who their audience is.
Yeah.
And, one pitch is better. One pitch to the right person is better than 50 pitches to, of the spray and pray variety.
Yeah, and also, if I'm just jumping with my other huge bugbear, if you've given the story away as an exclusive to someone else, which you are totally at liberty to do, don't call me.
You don't want to get second dibs?
No, oddly enough, no.
Fair enough. We have a couple of questions that have come in from our audience. First one's from Dan, who's just kind of keen to know what you guys are hearing from enterprise and government readers about what their hot issues are.
Basically, we've got to change of government, so that's going to kind of create a bunch of flux down in Canberra. So I think there's going to be the obvious kind of change piece around that. The interesting thing, I think, like reporting at government's really hard these days, because it used to be very easy to get senior bureaucrats who didn't care about the politics to actually brief you about stuff. In fact, that's actually how I started my career. They're a little bit more sort of shit scared these days to sort of say anything. So it'd be interesting to kind of see whether the culture changes on that. I think the trends in government aren't massively different to the trends in corporate. I think the cybersecurity tends to be front and center with everything, and also the other piece is just really kind of rapid digitalization. And let's face it, we've all used government services, and there's a long way to go on that front.
Thanks for that. We also have another question from Des, who asks, for all of you, maybe I'll put David on the spot if you want to have the first crack at answering this, and then we'll go to Simon. How do you balance the marriage of publishing stories under a masthead versus publishing via social platforms conversationally to the audience beyond your homepage?
Question, and it's something I've shifted over the last 12 months, where I used to avoid LinkedIn like the plague. It was just felt gross, like everybody trying to self-promote. And I've realized actually it's a lot more, the discussion on there is better and more meaningful than Twitter or Facebook or anywhere else, where I was pleasantly surprised when I do post my stories there. often with a point of discussion of like, what do you think about this? Then actually get really thoughtful comments and responses, and quite a lot of traction in a way that if you tweet often, it just feels like you're tweeting out into the ether, and you might get a like or two, and it just doesn't, I think the value is not really there, and the value is on LinkedIn, where I've been, I don't think those clicks often translate into actual.
I might just jump into a just on the social bit, just to finish off.
Yeah.
Back to the original intent of the question. My view basically is in a world where the vast majority, I'm talking more around sort of specialist press, it's less applicable to David with the subscription bit is appropriate. The days when the vast majority of the money came from advertising are gone. So most specialist publishers now are making a reasonable chunk of change out of the non-advertising part of the business, which is largely events and roundtables. At which point, I think the use of social is fairly important, specifically for Digital Nation. We actually think of LinkedIn as being one of the core channels for video. So we actually get a lot more video views, and we're perfectly happy to do it this way. We get a lot more video engagement on LinkedIn than we do on the homepage. And to us, the longer term point of something like LinkedIn is ultimately it is to drive people back to the channel and to kind of get them inside your own environment. And the other point is, as a general rule, I won't do anything with Facebook, because Facebook is a terrible company that makes money doing terrible things.
Hey, Burma, do you worry that LinkedIn could do a Facebook on you and, change the algorithm and sync the content out of you?
I would if LinkedIn was competent enough to do that, but nothing I've seen about LinkedIn's behavior in the last 10 years suggests to me that they're able to do that. I was hoping when Microsoft bought them.
I was about to say, who's LinkedIn owned by?
Well, Microsoft, I think. But they haven't really done much with it. Basically, it's one of the most frustrating things for me that LinkedIn should be this extraordinary, amazing platform for business content, and they treat it like a job ad and publishing platform. It's just, I don't think they've ever. I mean, they sold off $27 billion, and my credit card's over the limit. So I think they probably have something that I don't know, but I think it could just be so much better.
Any Microsoft employees or their representatives are on the call, thanks for joining us today. We're really welcome having you here with us to catch that. So we've talked a little bit around that, the impact of social and some of the things that people can do to get through to your publication. It's a really basic question that almost every, when I was on your side of the fence, I got asked probably almost every month. And that was like, what's the best way to actually talk to you and to actually communicate with you?
I'll go first. And I think ultimately it's a sort of respect for my time and my notifications thing that sort of I think people on the other side of the fence maybe get caught up in their own sort of stories and KPIs and think that it's okay to DM me on Snapchat, for example, with a story, or send me 10 WhatsApp messages in a row following up. Like, there are some pretty bad ones. I think in general, like, email is a really sort of basic, okay place to start, unless something's particularly urgent, and this is where your judgment comes into it, or, a high enough priority where it's then worthy of a call or a follow-up call. So I think I'd make calls to stuff that's quite urgent and you need to talk to me about it. Like yesterday, I got a call at, not naming and shaming, but 5 to 5 p.m. with a story pitch. And at least the way my day works is I'm on deadline, then filing for the next day's newspaper. And pitching me as a non-time specific story at 5 to 5 p.m. just doesn't make sense. And our relationships are all based on mutual trust and respect. And that trust needs to be there. And I'm more likely to open your email, I'm more likely to engage with you if you're someone that I have a good, strong relationship with and I can trust your judgment. So I think just respect that by sticking to email unless it's particularly urgent or time sensitive, and then pick up the phone or text me. That's okay. But some people just abuse that availability and send 10 follow-up texts or call me at all hours. And it's just, that doesn't work for anybody.
What about for you, Simon?
For years, I've said, call me, and nobody does. And I don't understand it. I don't understand it. In a profession that's called public relations or media relations, 99.5% of people choose to not have a relationship with me and just email me stuff without introducing themselves, without introducing the client. And I know that when I'm calling somebody up, I've got to mentally rehearse the conversation. What is it that I want? What is it that I'm trying to explain? What's the outcome that I want? And for me, every time you're pitching me, it's got to be a little seduction. And surely you want a bit of real-time feedback. You want to, okay, it might not be a video call. I hope it's a video call. But, you can't see me. You can get a little bit of non-verbal feedback from the intonation I'm using, from a whole bunch of things. So I've been saying for years, call me. Go through the process of thinking, is this a story for Simon? What would I say to him? And call me. And it just doesn't happen. So I totally don't get that. I get endless, hi, Simon, hope you're well. Do you want to run version 6.8 of my client's software? So
do you get a hi, Simon? You don't get a hi editor or hi journalist?
Oh, yeah, we get hi editor, hi journalist. Because my job is to focus on news from the APAC region, I get a lot of, dear valued media partner.
Mm. Well, that must make you feel better that you're valued.
Yeah, and the sign off is often we look forward to you publishing this press release. But in a weird
does that work
way,
by the way, Simon?
No. I mean, in a weird way, I've kind of found over the years that suggesting that people call me actually stops the emails and stops the calls. So maybe it works. Maybe people are saying to themselves, could I pitch that to Simon in a phone call, and deciding no and not picking up the phone? Hope, maybe it's working.
What about for you, Andrew?
I think it varies a bit. So first of all, ditto everything Simon said about ring me, particularly if it's regards. So in terms of my day-to-day stuff, I'm probably more involved in Digital Nation because it's a new publication than I am in the others. I don't tend to be involved at all in the IT news. Rai takes care of that. And I'm a bit more involved now in CRN just because of some changes I'm making there. But I'd say in terms of the news cycle stuff, we have an editor's inbox, send it there, and the guys will make their choices. If it's a high value thing, particularly if it's like visiting senior executives, etc., a phone call's worth it. And then, if it's, we're really kind of hungry for really kind of customer case studies and senior executive insights. And that's much easier handled over a phone call than it is via everything else, basically. But it does depend a little bit on the cycle. So if it's just basic news flow, use the established channel that we've created for you to get into that news flow.
Yeah, and having been a former CRN editor, can I just say, there is, I think it's editors at crn.com.au, and it used to bug the out of us when, people would hit that and hit each individual inbox, because if nothing else, it just complicates the workflow. If it's gone to editors, you can assign the story. If everyone thinks, oh, this has been pitched just to me, then it just creates newsroom confusion.
So just on the channel, because originally we were going to have Chris on the podcast as the editor of CRN. I mean, the channel's a very specific beast on its own within the niche, all the different niches of tech. What are some of the specific things that if people want to particularly hit the channel media, what are some of the specific things they need to talk about, or specific topics they need to try to hit?
The channel.
Yeah. Well,
everybody has to, if you work in IT media, at some point you have to work in the channel, because you have to go to a press conference and yell out, what about the channel?
Yeah.
It is precise, and it is important to recognize that precision. So, the relationships between the vendors and the channel partners is really at the kind of core of what it's about. It's a very different market to enterprise IT. It's a bit more kind of robust, I think, in some of the ways they operate. So I think understanding, like, how is this going to impact on this person's business? They're generally businesses under about 50 million, anything down to under $1 million, whatever. And they're utterly focused on growth and service. And so that's the sort of, to my mind, that's the angle that you want to go through with it. The bit I think that the channel could do better itself, and we could do better helping them, is there are extraordinary stories that come out of those channel partners around enterprise IT, and they get missed. I went through the experience, and I guess some of you would have been through the cycle as well when you were there, the Reading Impact Awards, which is basically the partners themselves putting in about these are the projects they've worked on. All those projects that make it through to the finals, every one of them belongs in Digital Nation.
In IT News and Digital Nation, yeah.
The talent capabilities of these companies is remarkable. and they don't get anywhere near the exposure. They're not great at it because they're not really focused on it. And, you know, we as journalists need to do, I'm talking specifically about the next media journalists, we need to do a better job exposing that capability.
Yeah, I remember one I think we gave an impact award to. It was a Sydney integrator that had basically put super rugged touchscreens inside prison cells. And they were piping training content directly into cells over those things. And then they tied access to the thing and access to video calls on that device to good behavior while you were inside. And it was this, you know, enormous sprawling story that touched on so many aspects of society. And, you know, who was letting us know about that? The channel organisation. It was pretty wild. But so sorry, if I can just finish. I wasn't joking before when I said you got to pitch the channel to the channel, because when I was on CRN, you know, we'd get all the consumer tech stuff, we'd get all the startup land stuff. They're focused publications. See them.
Yeah, and just to sort of finish on that point, some unsolicited advice for the PR folk out there is to make your vendor clients aware of that. Like for reasons I won't bore you with the moment, I went through an exercise about a month ago and I looked at every major IT title looking for case studies. And when I started in journalism, case studies were just the core of how you did IT media. And the only two publications, local publications, that did a lot of that stuff were actually Digital Nation and CMO, basically. The actual IT industry, including CIO Magazine, which actually started life as IT Casebook, seems to have abandoned describing what the technology is using for. So what I'd say is there are these amazing stories that your vendors can pitch to people like us, incorporating their partners, and not just to CRM, but, you know, to the others as well. So that is my one bit of unsolicited advice for the day.
People like to read about people.
I guess so. One of the things that we really focus on is trying to actually extract those stories from people. I think what a lot of companies don't realize is that they've got a huge number of really great things that are happening within their businesses, whether you're talking about vendors or integrators or whatever. They've all got great stories and projects they've worked on. They just struggle to find them and articulate them and pull them out and then get them in front of you guys so that they can be shared more broadly. Are you guys all still enjoying being in journalism? There's a lot of negativity around the industry, a lot of negativity sometimes about being around journalism. Do you guys still like it?
The only thing I ever wanted to do when I was a kid. I've sort of jumped in and out of it. Even when I left journalism to go into the commercial side, I only did that because that was the only way that I could raise enough money to hire more journalists, basically. I still think it's one of the most interesting, and if it's done properly, one of the most, you know, rewarding and important jobs that you can do. At the end of the day, our job is to tell stories, and ideally to include in those stories that other people don't want told. So I can't speak to those guys, but to me, it's a career I've just loved throughout.
Yeah, echoing that exact sentiment. I think it's, you know, the best job in the world. I did my work experience in year 9 at the same building I work at today. I've kind of just gone full circle, really, and so all I've ever wanted to do, and it's just been exactly what I thought it would be and more. And I think the one worry I have is that I think the general public switching off from news and not being as engaged maybe collectively as they used to be, and a lot of that's the media's fault. You know, the business model was screwed up in the late 90s and early 2000s when they put everything online for free and said, you know, this is the same as what was in the newspaper, but it's just free, and consumers haven't yet, on the whole, understood that it needs to be paid for, and that, you know, we only have good journalism from paying money for it. So the business model hasn't sorted itself out yet. I'm optimistic that it will, because I think we have a really human innate nature to know what's going on in the world around us and what our neighbors are up to. So I think one way or another, the business model will get there. But, you know, it's still a job that, you know, we've noticed people leaving the industry every year, but I'd love to be one of the last ones standing and watch the industry hopefully, you know, bounce back and get hiring again and growing again from a period over the last decade or so of decline.
Still loving it almost every day. Doesn't feel like a job. At the Reg, we've actually added 6 journos this year alone. We're growing pretty strongly as a business, and you know, somebody heading into his mid-50s. Long may that continue.
At the risk of
yeah.
can I just give us a question, Simon? Because to me, the qualifying question when I speak to someone who wants to be a journalist is, why do you want to be a journalist? Because I've found that the best journalists are people who love being journalists. Because let's face it, if we're being honest about it, it's a relatively unskilled job in terms of precise capabilities, like you. But to you, what's your what do you find makes the best journalist when you're doing the interview and you think, yeah, this is the person for us?
I really like what you say on your Twitter profile, Burmo, that you're curious, you can't help it. So curiosity is important. I think you need a little dose of righteous anger without tipping over into bitterness, because you've got to be able to, call out BS when you see it. We look for people who've got time in industry or who've got particular technical skill that gives them perspective. It's actually pretty valuable for us to be able to track a story for across the years. But yeah, that base curiosity is important. You got to want to hunt and think every day.
Yeah, I remember sitting next to you at an event overseas one year, and we were listening to a vendor telling us about their new strategy, and then both of us looking at each other and saying, but that's the opposite of the strategy from 3 years ago, like the exact opposite. And being able to have that, once you've been in it for a while, you've got that experience to be able to look back and call BS when you hear it, and ask a respectful question about why the pivot or why the change, without just calling out an obvious, something that obviously sounds like it's not quite right. What are your thoughts on coffee catch-ups and one-to-one briefings? Are they a thing that you guys like doing? Do you have the time for them now, given some of the other constraints we've talked about?
Come to me. I say, take the travel time out of it. The job, I often say, is showing up to listen. So, make a decent case for being worth listening to, and I will.
I don't have time for coffee catch-ups anymore, unfortunately. I've got time if you've got a story, so I'll do an interview over a coffee or a beer, and physically. But I don't, if it's just to catch up and find out what I'm interested in, or to find out what stories we're running, just read our publication, read The Australian. I think obviously connections and social relationships are incredibly important in our industry, but I think I get those from you bringing me a story, and for that relationship being formed there rather than a coffee catch up. We just don't have time with at least for me, just the way the day goes. I find if I do schedule one, then, often some news is breaking that I have to jump on. So it just doesn't really work. So after hours, I'm happy to grab a beer, but generally come to me with a story rather than just wanting to have a coffee.
I make a point of, I allocate 2 hours a week to speak to readers, basically, whether it's a Zoom call or a coffee or whatever, because I don't think there's anything more valuable than actually hearing directly from people. And the stuff that often, and the media side of things, media PR we talk about, it's a long way, it's very disconnected from what the actual readers care about. The other thing I'd say is I've actually instructed my journalists, the young journalists, about 5 young journalists in the team now, what I've instructed them that they're to spend half a day a month, which is not enough. I actually want to build it up, but half a day a month, not reporting, not writing, basically just going out and talking to people. And, to the extent, and this is a thing I'd actually like you guys to work with us on, I think it's important for journalists to go out and sit down with the vendors and just spend an hour or 2 hours getting really deeply into the technology. So as an example, my last job at Witch 50, VMware came in, but we went and saw them for 2 hours, and they just went through everything, a high level of detail. And it was one of those sessions where you could just ask every dumb question you can ever imagine as a journalist, which you don't necessarily want to do in a public forum like a press conference. And it's very, very valuable. And I don't think because everybody's chasing the Google spider, I don't think there's anywhere near enough of that goes on. Journalism used to be a job that was done on the phone. And, you would make 50 phone calls in a day until you sort of got what you needed. And I think that's been lost. So I think the direct connection stuff is important. But it just echo one of Simon's points, if it's at all possible, if you guys can come to us, just because that and you're really busy as well. But the what I don't have is half an hour each side of a 30-minute meeting to give up in the day. There just isn't the time to do it. And we can also, Zoom is pretty close to a face-to-face meeting, so I'm happy to do stuff like that as well.
So
guys, just to jump in on
Simon, you were about to say something.
My office is in Newtown, so I suppose I should have a kind of Newtown cafe bingo show, ticking them all off.
Got another question here about executive visits to Australia. Are executive visits still newsworthy or interesting to you when people come directly to Australia, or is it more a question of with Zoom the value of the executive visit to the inter-country has kind of diminished in value?
I like them and I take them up whenever they are on offer. I think in particular we lose a bit of perspective in Australia. We're a small island country, and it's nice having the global perspective of people telling you, oh, you're actually only our 8th biggest market or whatever it ends up being. I think we end up pumping our own tires up a little bit much in Australia, just given our geography and our market. So I think, getting that global leadership perspective is often very valuable to us as journalists and to our readers as well.
Are they always useful as story ideas for you, David, or are they do they kind of drift between being worthwhile as stories on their own or as valuable background for something that might come along in future?
Both. I think they are generally 90% of the time a story in and of themselves, just because they'll be able to comment on whatever the issues of the day are, whether it's like political, economic, whatever tech issues are happening at that moment, in a way that often the local execs can be stymied and say, oh, I'm not really sure. If it's at global CEO level, they're often a bit freer to talk or just have stronger opinions than maybe the local MD might. Or I just find, I will get a story 90% of the time out of that interview.
What about for you, Bomo, just before you go?
Basically, I really enjoy basically C-suite interviews. So having been through the process of building a business, one of the things that was incredibly valuable at the time, it was really very early days of focused on marketing tech, was actually just spending time with the CEOs and founders of those companies. And it was lucky at the time that it was an emerging market, so they had time in their hands. But what I found, one of the really valuable things for me in that situation was when they were a company of 100 people, when I built the relationships. 5 years later, when they were 10,000 people, they'd still take the call. So the relationship building thing is really important. And a final point, one of the reasons I'm very aggressive in terms of sending journos off to conferences overseas, I'm probably the freest in terms of the journalist time and allowing them to do that. I think one of them is the most value you get from those conferences is actually the face time with the senior executives. So, and the final point I'm making, it's really important, and I know it's hard from a PR perspective, not everything results in a story. So that shouldn't be the expectation.
Happy to meet people, again, it's a showing up to listen thing. But I'm quite selective with it, because we know that our audience is most likely to engage with a certain group of vendors. There's not a lot of point in me investing time in meeting somebody that we've never written about, or that is very small, or that isn't global and doesn't serve all of our readers. But having said that, there are sometimes great stories to be had. I mean, this week I had a CTO basically, reveal a whole bunch of really interesting stuff about global procurement in the current supply chain mess and a pretty detailed disposition of their data center ops. And that was just fodder for our readers, and not fodder. It was ambrosia for our readers.
And it's interesting because what is ambrosia for one set of readers might sound like junk for someone else, and vice versa. And I think when you're talking about that really deep technical stuff, there is an audience for it, but it's not for everybody. And similarly, the same thing with executive perspectives. They fit for a certain audience, but not for everybody. And so we come back to the publication.
Well, yeah, and that's so important, especially if you're kind of on the fringe of tech. There's this tendency to just chuck everyone who does tech into a bucket of tech journalism, tech publication. So, I got the press release this week about the start of Click Frenzy. And, I said, are you really sure I belong on this? And they went, oh, well, you know, you're on our tech journo list. Well,
yeah, I agree with you on that one 100%.
Excuse me there. I'm just sorry, guys. I'm just going to have to jump off now because my next man is running. But thank you very much for having me in today. And
thanks.
Just generally to the audience, I say pick up the phone and call. If I can take the call, I'll take the call. If I can't, such is life.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Andrew. Really appreciate you stepping in at the last minute.
Thanks.
Do you think the role of journalists is actually shifting to more of curation and analysis rather than just reporting facts, because there's so much of information that's just so easily available online now?
I think it's our job to, I think the news has become so commoditized these days in terms of just with social media, obviously, like I was saying a little bit before, those announcements get less valuable because they're sort of everywhere. So our work then becomes doing the more valuable stuff, which is the analysis, which is the perspective from being around, you know, a decade or whatever. And you can't fake that. I think you've either been around or you haven't. And the value add for us has to be that perspective and that analysis. So I think our job has shifted, but it's shifted towards the more valuable side of things rather than just writing a commoditized news announcement.
Look, I think we recognise that we're part of a bigger ecosystem of information now. But what I don't see is readers going direct to some of the online sources. So, you know, why do I have 400 curated RSS feeds? You know, some of them being, you know, Cisco router bug reports, because, you know, you talk about showing up to listen. Another function is being there to see or being there to read. And I feel like, sure, there's a lot of stuff out there, but being the one that observes it, or often being the one that understands it, can be valuable to readers. So, yeah. Or, you know, sometimes the things that you find online can suggest a story with perspective.
I guess this is, I've got a question here, I guess, and it's one of those things that I know that you and I perhaps have, you know, talked about in the past, Simon, sitting across a coffee or a bar or something else. And I think I've probably had a chat to you about this same sort of thing, David, in the past as well. But what are some of the biggest mistakes that people make when they pitch you? I mean, the obvious one is that they don't read your publication and pitch you the wrong thing, pitch you something completely irrelevant. But are there some other things that really get to you other than that?
I'll just go with a quick one that people try to be too cute, I think, and they might pitch an exclusive to me, but then pitch it under embargo elsewhere. And I think they try to sort of bite off more than they can chew. And I think if you just keep things really simple and transparent, it's okay to me if you say, I'm coming to you with this exclusive, but we're going to go elsewhere sort of the next day. Whatever the case is, if I find that you've sort of gone behind my back in a way, it's just a basic respect thing. So just don't try to be too cute and just be really upfront with whatever it is you're doing and whatever the media strategy is around it. And if you're upfront with me, then I'll be upfront back, and just that relationship will benefit.
Yeah, look, you've got an exclusive, but it turns out, you know, there's an international web exclusive and a local print exclusive and a Twitter exclusive. That's bullshit, you know. I'm going to say something very silly now. An exclusive needs to be completely unique.
Shouldn't be controversial, but it is.
Yeah. A couple of other things. Look, I think you know, absolutely, please read the publication. It's not hard. You know, you've got such an enormous sample of evidence to work from, and yet so many people in media relations seem to ignore it. You know, as Burmo said, they don't accept contributed editorials. Neither do we. We get so many pictures about that every week, and it's just, you know, it's an asymmetric use of time, and it's rude. I suggest you need to think about who's doing your pitching. When I get a pitch from an account coordinator, I know that there's somebody who's very young and young in the industry, and who, you know, is young enough to be my children. And I understand that, young people need to start in the industry, but a very young media relations practitioner is probably going to struggle with the kind of inquiry that comes back from a very experienced journalist. And especially when you're repping pretty techie brands, I just feel like there's this kind of, big mismatch there between the person you're pitching to and the person who's going to handle the response. And being non-responsive. So, when a press release comes in, you've got to be able to back it up with somebody to comment on it. And you've got to recognise that we're in the news business, and I generally get something published within 2 hours of seeing some information. That's the kind of deadline I'm working to, certainly by close of play. So if you've got me to yes on an idea, but then there's no one to explain it, nobody to offer the depth, then that's tremendously frustrating.
Yeah, look, I must say that, and because my background was originally working on the other side, working as a buyer and as a user of technology at enterprises, when I flipped into journalism, I could ask questions around the technologies and around the usage of a technology, and it was rare that I was able to get a timely, direct answer to a technical question. And it was usually because of the layers that question had to go through before it actually got to the qualified person to ask it, to be able to answer it. I think that can be a big challenge when you're trying to get stuff quickly.
Yeah.
So as compared to overseas executives visiting Australia, is it newsworthy to talk about local companies and technology? I mean, is being an Australian company in tech newsworthy in itself?
Not in itself. Existing is not a story. And I think, people get in their own bubble of thinking what they're doing is the most important thing. And sometimes it is, but just sort of virtue of existence is not enough. You need to actually if it's something newsworthy, whether that's a milestone or, there's always a news angle, but existing is not one of them.
Just on that though, David. So, I mean, for an Australian company, let's say an Australian company goes through and gets a funding round, a good seed round or a Series A. Is there like a magic number that pricks your ears up that you go, right, now that's actually worthwhile as a story? Like, is 10 million the new 1 million, or is there, where are we kind of at with that?
I can only speak for the Australian, but we've sort of moved away from those funding round stories in general, just because a couple of reasons. Like, I felt like a bit of a robot writing them, where it was sort of X company raises X $1 million, CEO says X, investor says X. And as a reader, you're not getting a lot from that. It's sort of a bit of a so what. And so for both readers and for myself, just wasn't particularly valuable. And I'm looking deeper now at, you might do a funding round, but then it's, what are you going to do with it? What's your big picture vision for a decade from now of what you're trying to build and the impact you're trying to have on the world and on the technology sector? And so the funding round info can come like the 5th paragraph down, and it's more about, right now we're hiring 100 people. We're building this thing we hope will be massive. And that's, to me, the angle now that I'm focused on more than just, and those stories are quite commoditized and quite cheap. So I think it's good that, at least for us, we're moving away from those, just because they don't say a lot.
What about like in the Asia Pac space, Simon? I mean, Asia Pac's a very broad area, and there's a very diverse range of different cultures and organisations that you're writing to or writing about. Is being Australian, does that kind of separate some of those stories out, make those stories more interesting necessarily?
Zero interest in Australian companies, zero interest in startups, zero interest in, we're growing fast, we're trying hard, we did a nice thing for people. Sorry, that's just not our bag. The thing that matters to us is, what does this company mean for our readers? So, what does your technology or your service let my readers do tomorrow that they struggle to do today? Why do you matter? What's the problem that you solve? And why is that problem important? Now, in our context, that's nearly always going to be the problem that business faces managing information at scale. And, totally not, we think we can revolutionise the second-hand football ticket market with NFTs.
So really, Australian is just an adjective. It's not a story.
Yeah. And, ditto, and I would say the same to anybody who has, got a company that's opened in 4 ASEAN countries or that has opened in Singapore or, opened anywhere. Nationality doesn't matter to us. Our tribe is the global band of hands-on IT pros, and they're the people that we're loyal to, and they're the people that we serve, not by we don't distinguish people by nationality.
So just in contrast to that, David, because I like what Simon just said there, where he's got a tribe. Like, he knows his tribe is not defined by a national boundary, but is defined by a set of common activities and interests in being deep in tech. Who's your tribe?
Kind of the direct opposite, really, where you have to have an Australian angle, really, for us to be interested. It's the national newspaper. If it's an overseas executive saying something that has no relevance to Australia, then I'm not interested, unless it is a tech giant, like a controversial thing that Mark Zuckerberg's done, or Elon Musk. But then I'll still try to find a way to tie that back to the Australian market, because just that's the virtue of our publication, is where the Australian, it's in the title. So we do need that local angle very specifically.
We've actually kind of come to the end of our time a little bit ahead of the schedule. But I think we've had lots of really interesting questions that have come in from the audience, far more interesting than the questions I came up with before we started this. So thank you to all the people in the audience who have pitched in questions and comments as they've gone along. There was a couple of things there about thanks for your insights into reframing funding news, David. So there was a couple of people thanked you for that. There was just being able to talk about what it is that actually matters and how to get through to your publications, I think has been immensely valuable. I know there's quite a few people there that perhaps Media-Wize might consider kind of almost competitors, but we think the market's big enough to share for everybody. And we're kind of hopeful that this not only helps us, but also helps the market, but, and helps you guys do your jobs more efficiently and better, because you're going to get better stories pitched to you from the people who have been in this webinar today. I think, the comment just been made that this is a really good reminder that the media is really just humans. And that's something that's pretty easy to forget. I know that when we speak to people and speak to clients, one of the things we say is, the media is not this one big amorphous bubble. There are a lot of very targeted niches and audiences within that. And if you want to get your stories told, you've got to know those niches and know what stories appeal to those specific groups of people. And to put it in Simon's word, it's about knowing what stories are going to be right for that tribe. So I think being able to do that and be able to talk about that today openly and freely has been really, really valuable. So thank you from all of us. Thank you to our panelists today, for Simon and for David and for Andrew, who's had to duck out early. So we thank you to those guys as well for their time. For those of you that don't know us, Media-Wize is a media training and tech PR agency. Our focus is on B2B. We focus on talking to enterprises and businesses about technologies that are for other businesses. So we don't talk about consumer tech very much in our business, but we do talk about the sorts of things that Simon and David and Andrew were talking about the tech companies that actually make a really huge difference to all organizations across the world. Thank you, everybody, for your time.